was another argument that they used out of Matthew 24. And then Ephesians 4 and 1 Corinthians 12 talked about the gifts of the Spirit, which includes the gift of prophecy. And they especially liked Ephesians 4 verse 12, until we come to the unity of the faith. Prophets would be needed until we come to the unity of the faith. And Adventists are quite right in saying we're not quite there yet. So it's quite appropriate for us to have prophetic gift continuing until we come to the unity. Now if we go to the biblical passages, there are a couple that are important. 2 Timothy 3, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. And 2 Peter 1, holy men of God spoke. But if you read those carefully, you'll discover they tell you almost nothing about the nature of inspiration. It just simply says Scripture is inspired and that holy men God spoke. Now I've gotten myself into trouble with some, at least I've horrified some, by saying we ought to study what the Bible itself says. And some people would say, well, no, you're using the wrong method. You're using the inductive method. You ought not to take everything from the Bible. The Bible comes from God, and we ought to use the deductive method. Take that which you know to be true. I think when you have a variety of witnesses, you have to listen to all the witnesses. And I rather like what one of my colleagues said, that the Bible is like a scrapbook, a family scrapbook. You can't pull out any of the pages and throw them away. You may not like Uncle Jake, but he's got a page in there, see? So you just kind of, and Brever Childs from Yale has founded the principle, has talked a lot about the canonical principle. So you take what's here and you just describe what's happening there. And that's what I have found to be very helpful in dealing both with the Bible and Ellen White. Now I want to just give you part of my own personal confession here, because why Ellen White is so important to me. Now I grew up in a conservative home, conservative in practice, but my life was not deeply imprinted by the use of Ellen White in the home. My book, my copy of Messages to Young People, for example, was not given to me by my parents, but by my sister for my 8th grade graduation. See, I have colleagues who have horror stories of the way Ellen White was used in their home, but fortunately mine was gentle enough so that I could discover for myself. Now, my real confrontation with the world of scholarship and personal experiences came when we went to Scotland. We were conservative Adventists, and at the personal level there were 4 issues that we had to face when we went there. Living in the country, there's just not very much country land in Scotland. Church schools, there are no church schools. Early 70s, wedding ring. And eating between meals. Now those of you with a deep background in Ellen White will know what I meant. I had to struggle with Romans 14, religion is more than meat and drink, until we finally could turn that corner. That was terribly important for me to be faithful, to find that some principles are more important than others, and people are the most important thing. I had to work that through in Scotland. And that's why when one of my students said, what you're doing with the Bible and with Ellen White is more of a case book than a code book. And I really like that. And a case book never gives you the last word. All it does is give you something to choose from. See? And I think if we would use the Bible and Ellen White more like a case book with the great principles of Jesus' 2 great commands and the 10 commandments as the framework, I think we would have a great deal more openness. Now, also in the academics, one of the men that I worked with most closely had lost his faith in Scripture when he went to the university. He'd become a Christian, and he began to discover diversity in Scripture, and it didn't line up with what conservative Christians believed, and as a result, when I got there, he no longer believed. Now, there was something very interesting. Paul Grove, my teacher at Walla Walla College, had introduced me to the first few pages of Selected Messages, Book 1. These are manuscripts that Ellen White wrote in the 1880s, but they were not published until 1958. And then the Introduction to Great Controversy. Now, I didn't take my Ellen White books to Scotland with me, but those broad statements there had seeped into my mind far enough so that when I went to the university, I was not struck with the same kind of rigidity that my supervisor had when he studied the Bible. And as I look at the role of Ellen White in my own experience, what happened was she allowed me to keep my faith in Scripture until I could then go to the Bible. And when I'd worked certain principles out in the Bible, then I could come back to Ellen White. And what I'd learned in the Bible was very helpful in terms of studying Ellen White. So I don't see Ellen White as a burden at all. She's been a great blessing to me, and I continue to enjoy her writings, but I never use her as a last word almost on anything. In fact, there's one amazing statement where she herself expressed, and I'll just read it here quickly for you, with reference to vegetarianism. She made this comment: if you had not got any better conviction that you won't eat meat because Sister White does not eat any, If I am the authority, I would not give a farthing for your health reform. And I think most of the anger against Ellen White is that people perceived her as an authority. Ellen White said, so I have to do it. We must somehow come back and see the diversity of her writings so that we can then live in a broader base. Now, I would summarize 3 basic principles that are important for understanding Ellen White and seeing her as a blessing, not as a curse. Number 1, that she provides motivation, not just information. Just like Paul, the end of 1 Corinthians 4, shall I come to you with stick or with love and the spirit of gentleness? And you have the full spectrum in between. Anyone who's been a pastor, teacher, or a parent knows what it means. Your children are different, and you have to choose somewhere along the line. And that's a marvelous principle which we could explore further, but Ellen White's primary concern is motivation so that people will love God and love one another, and you mix and match the bits and pieces. The second thing is her growth. Ellen White was moving from fear to joy, and that has been one of the most exciting things for me. If you just take the story of John the Baptist, for example, I grew up hearing Desire of Ages, a gentle picture. And when I went back to 1858, the first edition, here I read that John's life was sorrowful and without pleasure. By the time you get to 1897, she actually says John enjoyed his life of simplicity. And one of my students quipped, oh, you mean the more Ellen White enjoyed her experience, the more John the Baptist enjoyed his. And I think that's marvelous. Our experience with the Lord reflects how we interpret Scripture, and that's certainly what is the case as far as Ellen White is concerned. So you have, first point, motivation more than information. Secondly is growth. And the third point I would say is treat Ellen White as a case book so that you can then use those in an illustrative way and be helpful and not oppressive when you bring those to play with others. Now, I'd like to conclude here with just a brief statement from Ellen White and one from C.S. Lewis to illustrate why I think we ought to treat the prophets with very special care. Ellen White made the comment in her education, and it's in her very earliest Education Council, 1872. She talks about children being thrown on their own judgment as fast and as far as is practicable. I mean, an outrageously liberal statement. And then the quote from C.S. Lewis, which I think is a marvelous one. Screwtape Letters, and Screwtape was, C.S. Lewis was a bit chagrined that that had become such a famous book because he didn't think that that was his best writing. But it's the story of how Screwtape is training his nephew Wormwood against the enemy, which is God. And C.S. Lewis makes this amazing statement through Screwtape. Screwtape says to Wormwood, do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human being, no longer desiring, but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks round on a universe from which all trace of him seems to have vanished, asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. God's goal for us is for us not to be dependent on what somebody else says, even if that's a prophet, even if it's a scripture, but we discover goodness and we live for God even when the heavens seem as brass. By God's grace, we'll be able to see Ellen White in that role and help us to reach that goal. And then she will indeed be a blessing to us and our community. And those who believe and those who explore will be able to come and be part of the very same community.